Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a chance to get some food and say hi to people that you haven't seen for a while. And I hope you're ready for an exciting presentation. I'm the Reverend Rosemary Bray McNatt. It's my honor to serve as president of Starr King School for the Ministry in Oakland, California. But our presenter this morning is someone known to most of you, the Reverend Dr. John Buehrens. I don't need to tell you the long and illustrious history of John, but I can say that one of the things that is most fabulous about John is his great love for Unitarian and Universalist history and the many contributions that he's made to our knowledge and understanding. I'm especially excited for him to speak today because he's going to talk more about someone who is important in the life of California, but is a namesake of our school. And so without further ado, the Reverend Dr. John Buehrens.
Thank you, Rosemary. I've been affiliated with Starr King School for the Ministry in more ways than I can count. I served on its board of trustees in 2 different incarnations, served as part of the core faculty right after I was president of the association, and more recently I've been in the adjunct faculty teaching things like Unitarian Universalist theologies and worship and liturgy. It's always a pleasure for me to support anything having to do with the outstanding progressive theological school in North America, and to thank my friend Rosemary for 10 years of fabulous leadership to the school. I spent the morning with my dear wife Gwen at her parish, St. James Episcopal Church. And I'll bet you there's not 2 Episcopalians there who really know the story of St. James. Just as I'll bet there's not 2 people in the room here who really know the full story of Thomas Starr King, despite the fact that he's right out there on our grounds. This, for example, is a portrait of Thomas Starr King that I knew nothing about until 2 weeks ago. It hangs at the First Church in Boston. And I didn't know that he almost became the minister of that congregation when he was 25 years old. Neither did Rosemary, by the way. It's been in none of the biographies, which just goes to show that historical research builds and builds and builds, and you learn things all the time about figures that you had. Doesn't he look young? Well, he really was. Let's advance the slide again. What most of us know about Starr King, of course, is that he served this church for just under 4 years, but made an enormous difference. It was just from April of 1860 to March of 1864. Usually his greatest accomplishments are framed as political. And frankly, in this year of all, it strikes me that it is probably wise for us to step back and say perhaps not the greatest contributions we make are in the political realm. They're longer term than that. Although Thomas Starr King is appropriately credited with, quote, having saved California for the Union in the plaque that's out by the sarcophagus and so forth, and for raising more money for humanitarian relief than any other single American during the Civil War. 1/4 of all of the money raised by the U.S. Sanitary Commission. There's plenty that people don't know about him. Go ahead. We have the best street sarcophagus in San Francisco, by the way. It says so on a plaque in our staff room. It happens to be the only one. Bob McNatt was asking me how he got an exemption from being moved down to Colma when everybody else was in 1906, but he was fairly famous for at least his political accomplishments in that era. The sarcophagus gives a good summary of how he was cited as an apostle of liberty, a humanitarian, obviously a Unitarian and minister who in the Civil War bound California to the Union and I'll talk about how he did that because it was more than politics, and led her to excel all other states in support of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, the predecessor to the Red Cross. This part is no longer true. His statue, together with that of Father Junipero Serra, represents California in the national capital. His name is borne by a Yosemite peak, a man to match our mountains, placed in 1960. During the Civil War, Glenna Matthews, one of his biographers, one of his most recent biographers, really captures the political side of Thomas Starr King. But those who are lifted up by politics can sometimes be torn down by politics. In 1906, on the very last day of the legislative session, the California legislature, in its infinite wisdom, passed a joint resolution that replaced Thomas Starr King's statue in Washington with that of Ronald Reagan. The state senator who introduced the resolution explained, to be honest with you, I wasn't sure who Thomas Starr King was. And I think there's probably a lot of Californians like me. You can still visit that statue, however, on any visit to Sacramento, where behind the state capitol, in what is known as the Civil War Memorial Grove, the statue still stands. There it is. I had the pleasure of visiting with him when I was last up in Sacramento, lobbying for domestic workers to be included in OSHA protections here in our great state. By the way, the governor vetoed the bill. Note that one. Advance, please. When TSK arrived in the free state of California in April of 1860, this democracy was dominated by pro-slavery politicians to a degree that's hard for us to remember. It had produced John C. Fremont, who was the first candidate at the presidential level of the Republican Party in 1856, but he failed to carry the state where he'd been briefly a U.S. senator. And he was, frankly, no complete anti-racist. He and the Mariposa Battalion, in the interests of protecting his claim to the Mariposa Ranch, had actually kicked off one of the major episodes in the indigenous genocide that afflicted this state throughout the 1850s and into the 1860s. But perhaps the most dramatic instance of the pro-slavery domination of the state in 1860 is the duel between the Chief Justice of the state, David Terry, and David Broderick, the U.S. Senator, in September of 1859. This is just months before Thomas Starr King arrives. And why? Because Terry was a completely pro-slavery politician from the so-called Breckinridge fragment or faction of the Democratic Party, while Broderick was a Douglas Democrat who just thought that the issue of slavery ought to be left to the states. It's that business of leaving things to the states, that's a continuing theme, you know. When Broderick was killed, the eulogy was given by Lincoln's close friend, a fellow lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, who'd come out here, Edward Dickinson Baker, who later became the U.S. Senator from Oregon. In 1859, and actually several years before that, African Americans weren't allowed to testify in courts of this state. 800 African Americans left California in 1858. This is hardly ever remembered. They hired a ship to take them up to British-ruled Victoria on Vancouver Island, where the governor, born in Jamaica, was a man of mixed race, and slavery was outlawed. By the way, some eventually came back after Starr King visited them there. That's often forgotten as well. And in 1859 and 1860, when Starr King was just beginning here in the state, The governor, John Weller, wanted, if the Union was going to fall apart, to declare California and Oregon to be a Pacific Republic, and then unite with the Confederacy in a loose alliance. Go ahead. The best statue, however, of Thomas Starr King, in my view, is the one that we can all go see at the 8th Avenue entrance of Golden Gate Park. It's done by Daniel Chester French, another Unitarian, by the way, who grew up in Concord, Massachusetts, and who got art lessons via Emerson with May Alcott. He's the sculptor who did the Lincoln Memorial and the Lincoln Penny. The inscription, "In him eloquence, strength, and virtue were devoted with fearless courage to truth, country, and his fellow men." It makes him look 8 feet tall, as bronze statues of that era tend to do, when in fact he stood just barely over 5 feet. He weighed maybe 110 pounds, but he would say, "But when I'm mad, I weigh a ton." And as I've been trying to indicate, when he got here, he had plenty to be irate about. Go ahead. The rarely told backstory begins with his birth, which was nearly 200 years ago, on the 17th of December, 1824, in New York City, where his father, the Universalist minister Thomas Farrington King, and his mother, Susan Starr King, greeted him as their firstborn. He had 5 younger siblings eventually. His father had no particular training for the ministry. That was typical of Universalists. He'd been a cobbler, but he gave a stirring July 4th address to a working men's gathering in New York City, expressing his Universalist convictions theologically. And the next thing he knew, he was being recruited to be a popular circuit-riding Universalist minister in New York and Connecticut, eventually ending up as the minister of quite a large Universalist congregation in Charlestown, Massachusetts, directly across from Boston, in the shadow of the Bunker Hill Monument, which was dedicated, or the cornerstone was laid just when Starr King was an infant by Lafayette, no less, when he returned to America to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the American Revolution. And it was finally dedicated in 1842 with a stirring address by Massachusetts Senator Daniel Webster, of whom more later. The real moving event in Starr King's youth was the death of his father, who died of tuberculosis, which was endemic in the time, of course, at the age of only 42 in 1839, when his eldest child was not yet 15. Starr, as he was always called, then immediately became the sole support of his widowed mother and those 5 younger siblings. He went to work as a clerk. Talk about being a striver and someone who knew the value of education. Between the ages of 15 and 18, Thomas Starr King gave himself the equivalent of a Harvard education. He mastered Latin, Greek, started in on French, Italian, and German. He knew enough math and classical rhetoric to clearly have qualified for admission to Harvard. He read metaphysics. There is a stunning letter that he wrote at the age of 17 to his lifelong friend, Randolph Ryer, with whom he bonded at the age of 15 in New York, explaining the difference between the Transcendentalists and the empiricists. It's a damn sight clearer than Emerson's own lecture on the subject. Randolph Ryer, by the way, although Glenna Matthews declined to honor the claim, I think was almost certainly of mixed race, and that this friendship had a profound impact on Thomas Starr King's development and attitudes toward race. He passed as white, But there's a reason why there are 18 references in Starr King's almost weekly letters to Randolph Fryer, referring to him as "you black scamp" and such like, including the term octoroon, which may have been quite accurate. Let's go ahead. As a young striver and orator, he went from being a clerk in a store to one in the Boston Navy Yard, where he also was a bookkeeper, and then an assistant teacher at the Bunker Hill Grammar School. And on the 4th of July, just sort of like Pa, in 1842, just after Daniel Webster's address dedicating the Bunker Hill Monument, he gave the 4th of July address in Medford, Massachusetts, heard by Universalist leader Hosea Ballou II, later the founder of Tufts University, who became Starr King's major mentor. He was made principal of a grammar school teaching Latin and Greek at the age of 18. And he was installed as minister in his father's old pulpit in Charlestown at the age of 20. This, he quickly realized, was a mistake. The church ladies still patted him on the head. Henry Whitney Bellows, perhaps the most influential Unitarian minister in the country at what later was called All Souls Church in New York City, wanted Starr King, after he heard him speak at an evening service in New York, to come to New York as the minister of what became the Community Church of New York, the Church of the Messiah. But the leaders of that congregation said, no, no, no. We can't have someone as our minister in the Unitarian Church who doesn't have a Harvard degree. Turned down there, he realized that the other problem was that he was truly ill with the tuberculosis that had killed his father. And he took the prescription that was common to the time and an ocean voyage and spent some time on the island of Faial in the Portuguese Azores. And then, on returning, accepted another call to the very troubled Hollis Street Church in Boston. He was 22 when he became the minister of a congregation that had been just decimated by the division over the previous minister, John Pierpont, who had a terrible tendency to preach every Sunday about the rum that was stored in the basement of the church by the trustees. He saved that institution. Theodore Parker, who was packing the music hall with 2,000 seats every Sunday, and therefore was some judge of rhetoric, referred to young Thomas Starr King as the best preacher in Boston. And that should be understood when I go back to that story of how he was almost enticed to the very prestigious, if also somewhat troubled, First Church in Boston. And notice, he got his Harvard degree, probably thanks to Hosea Ballou, who had become an overseer. Harvard awarded him an honorary Master of Arts in 1852 when he was what, 27? He stayed at Hollis Street, and throughout that period, not only circulated among the Transcendentalists and became a leading member of its second generation, he was recommended as a lecturer by both Parker and Ralph Waldo Emerson. Go ahead. Here's a good this photographer, whoever it may have been, it's anonymous, is the only person who ever managed to make Starr King look tall by shaping this portrait the way he did and kind of lengthening the face, as near as I can tell. With typical wit, he said, "They have made me AM. I wonder what I shall be in the PM." By this point, he has settled enough in the ministry to marry Julia Wiggin, who came from East Boston. When he accepted the call to San Francisco, there were 4 other congregations that were after him as their minister: Buffalo, Cincinnati, Washington, Baltimore. He saw that the challenge out here, although it was probably not the easiest post by a long shot, and not the one that his wife wanted him to accept, was the one that really had the mark of destiny on it, the one where he could really make a difference. Julia was so ill on the voyage via Panama that she had to be carried off the ship when they arrived. They arrived on a Saturday late afternoon, by the way, and Starr King immediately announced to the moderator of the church, who greeted him, that he wanted to preach the next morning. So they hurried and took out advertisements in the evening newspapers and the morning newspapers, and lo and behold, on the following day, he preached on the text, "They shall come from the north and the south and the east and the west." Julia didn't really like it here initially. It took her over a year to really become acclimated to what she called San Francisco. The dust of the place constantly blowing in her windows and into her kitchen. She kept reminding her husband that he was only on leave from the Hollis Street congregation, and would he please go back? The San Francisco church had had 5 ministers in the previous 10 years. Now, by the way, that had nothing to do with the congregation. One of them came via Panama, contracted yellow fever, preached twice here, and then died. It was a hardship post. And many of the pews in the 1,000-seat building then owned by First Unitarian on Stockton Street were unoccupied when he arrived, and insufficient to really cover the expenses of the church and his own salary. Starr King preached that first Sunday to an overflow congregation, and by the second Sunday, they were out in the street. Go ahead. Although they admitted John C. Fremont and his wife, Jessie. Nominally Episcopalians, they took a pew in the Stockton Street church, and this woman played a leading role in Starr King's political ascendancy and efficacy. The daughter of U.S. Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, who was a staunch supporter of the so-called Missouri Compromise, slavery shall go no farther. Jessie had been eloped at the age of 17 with the Western explorer John C. Fremont, who became a senator out here and owned the Mariposa Ranch and mines. When she and her husband attended Starr King's second sermon, they invited him and his wife to dinner at their cottage at Black Rock. Have any of you ever been up on Upper Fort Mason and seen the historic plaque that's there for Julia? Okay, good. I commend it to you. It's a wonderful view. It looks directly out at Alcatraz. There, she began a salon that included Starr King, but also the young writer Bret Harte, who immediately joined the congregation here, and, by the way, married the alto in the choir. Plus a very important photographer, Carlton Watkins, the pioneer landscape photographer of California. Lawyer Frederick Billings, for whom Billings, Montana is named, who was one of the most important legal minds in San Francisco in the time, and the naturalist William Brewer, who, among other intellectuals and notables in the city. This little salon, then when Jessie left, became really Starr King's circle of friends and the first real intellectual circle on the West Coast. Go ahead. Back east, he already had an established reputation as a lecturer. He said when he was feeling rather stretched economically, "I will go anywhere for fame, $50 and my expenses." He was a success on the platform primarily, I think, because he was unpretentious, self-deprecating, never condescending, no matter what kind of audience he was addressing. When he gave lectures like Substance and Show, or a talk on Socrates to working class people, and the importance of the examined life, of conscience, or the laws of disorder, which is a hilarious lecture, sight and insight, existence and life, music, the privileges and duties of patriotism. One working class fellow left one of Starr King's lectures supposedly saying, "Well, them's ideas." And perhaps the most astute critic of all of the speakers on the Lyceum circuit in those years, Edwin Whipple, said, "We listened to Daniel Webster for reason and logic. We listened to Thomas Starr King because he touched our hearts." Go ahead. From boyhood, one of the sources of inspiration and consolation in his life had been the natural world. Whether it was at the seacoast listening to the waves or in the White Hills of New Hampshire, he saw the sublime in the natural world as a sign of divine origin and the constant transference of creative spirit from beyond us through the natural world to our very hearts and souls. In 1859, he published The White Hills, Their Legends, Landscape, and Poetry. A beautiful book, by the way. I was just showing Rosemary a first edition, which we happen to have here at the church, which is full of beautiful photographs of the scenery of the White Hills as well. Nobody could describe scenery as persuasively as Thomas Starr King did. His letters from California when he went up to Yosemite just 3 months after arriving, early July, were for the Boston Evening Transcript, but also then reprinted in other papers. There was no copyright back then. And he got letters of congratulations from people like John Greenleaf Whittier, the Quaker poet, and from William Cullen Bryant, who had presided over the breakfast that saw him off on this expedition to California. He persuaded Carleton Watkins, who had photographed the mines for the Fremonts, to go up to Yosemite in the following summer and take the first photos of the stunning landscape. Those two made their way east, in no small part via Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose son came out here in 1862 and was hosted by Thomas Starr King and went home with 2 Watkins photographs of Yosemite that still hang in the Emerson House in Concord. One in the room where Emerson wrote all of his essays and lectures. My friend Tyler Green, who's the author and biographer of Carleton Watkins, has a book coming out called Claiming Yosemite: The Civil War, the California Genocide, and the Invention of National Parks, that finally, at long last, acknowledges that it was Thomas Starr King who played the key role in saving Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove. By the way, John Muir doesn't even come to California until 1872. And how did that happen? I think Henry Whitney Bellows, Frederick Billings, Jesse Benton Fremont, and some of the leading members of the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate, presided over by Unitarian Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, passed the Yosemite Act in June of 1864 as an unspoken memorial to Thomas Starr King, knowing what he had done, not only to save California for the Union, but for the Sanitary Commission and its important. Now, Tyler's book is going to acknowledge the racialism that was pervasive in the 19th century, partly as a result of the so-called myth of progress. Indigenous people, particularly, were just widely ignored by even the most progressive souls, seen as somehow predestined to vanish. The one exception that I have found, the real courageous exception, is young Bret Harte, who, as the editor and reporter for a newspaper up in Humboldt County, had accurately reported the so-called Wyatt Massacre that took place there in February of 1860, and then editorialized about it, saying, "And you claim to be Christians, bringing civilization." They had slaughtered, unprovoked, 300 or more Native American elders, women, and children during a time when the menfolk were gathering materials and hunting for the spring festival of renewal. Let's go on. Here's a photograph that Watkins took. It's, of course, rather badly reproduced, but the originals, which are often displayed at the Museum of Modern Art or at the Society of California Pioneers, are immense. They're called mammoth photographs. The camera he had was 3 feet by 3 feet. Imagine getting it up there, and the photographs were taken by spreading an emulsion over glass, and a technique that he also did portrait photography. I've been unable to determine, however, whether he ever did one of the photographs of Thomas Starr King and Julia that exist. The early photographs that Watkins took, my friend Tyler Green has pointed out, clearly show that instead of being emptied of the native population, there were signs of the Awenatchee Band of Miwok having built shelters, controlling burns there, probably hiding away from the potential invasion of ranchers, lumbermen, and others. That's what Yosemite was saved from. Go ahead. It's also hard for us to remember how much anti-abolitionist or anti-slavery activism there was in the United States, including here in California. Going all the way back to the 1830s, there were riots in all of the major cities of the East, in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, trying to tar and feather abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, or, well, I could go on. Here in California, a branch of the so-called wide awakes developed. Given the currency of the term woke today, I love the fact that the people who rose up to protect abolitionist speakers and Republican candidates were called the wide awakes. They were a somewhat clandestine and secret society of young men who had wore capes and looked a little militaristic, but they were there to do things like protect Senator Baker when he sailed from San Francisco to take his post as a senator in Washington, and also, by the way, send off the recently deposed U.S. Senator William Gwynn as he went back to his plantation in Mississippi. Here in San Francisco, the leading supporter of the Confederacy was the minister of Calvary Presbyterian Church, which ironically, Vanessa, you do the interfaith relations around here lately. Did you know that Calvary Presbyterian was organized in the Unitarian Church? The existing Old First Church was considered too new light and too progressive. So the more fundamentalist Presbyterians, or Old Light Presbyterians, called William Anderson Scott from New Orleans to found Calvary. Now it's a progressive church, but it started out as the bastion of pro-slavery sentiment in the city, although as Thomas Starr King had his influence here in town, it gradually changed. And on one Sunday, William Anderson Scott approached his own church building, only to find that the wide awakes had draped the whole front of the church in the stars and stripes. the symbol of the Union, because he was given to praying for, quote, both presidents, both Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, which, let me just say, Thomas Starr King's comments about this just dripped with sarcasm and how can you? He gave a lecture on Washington's birthday in February of 1861 that was probably the turning point in sentiment here in the city toward the Union. At the end of the lecture, when he finished, Bret Harte leapt to the stage from the box occupied by Jesse Benton Fremont and started waving the Union flag. And the entire hall, nearly 2,000 people, the largest hall in San Francisco, rose to their feet. The lecture was so popular that it was repeated here in the city the next night, and then repeated in Maryville, in Stockton, in Sacramento. It really kicked off Starr King's major lecture campaign on behalf of keeping California in the Union. The next lecture that he gave, Webster was despised in Boston because he had promoted the Compromise of 1850 that brought California into the Union, but at the cost of the Fugitive Slave Act. Starr King was wise enough to realize that Webster was best known for his speech about preserving the Union. Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. That's what the people needed to hear. And although he was constantly out facing pro-slavery audiences in small towns in the foothills, the mining camps, where people were armed with guns and with Bowie knives, he risked his own life to face down people who thought he was worthy of being lynched in order to stand for the principles that he knew this country needed to try to live up to. It's typical of him that in the election of 1862, for example, when his own parishioner Leland Stanford was standing for election as governor, he framed the issue as choosing between Jesus or Barabbas. He opposed the efforts to have a premature peace. Now, we have an engrossed scroll of the speech that he gave on that theme, knowing that if the Congress and Lincoln sued for peace with the South, it would mean the continuation of slavery. And as I mentioned earlier, in 1863, when it was just beginning to be clear that perhaps the Union cause would prevail, he did the extraordinary thing of striking out on a long trip with Julia with him to Mount Shasta, through Oregon, where he gave the first Unitarian sermon in that state and laid the groundwork for founding the first Unitarian church in Portland, on into Washington, and then sailing from Puget Sound over to Victoria. Why? To thank those African Americans who had fled California for sending him $1,000 for the Union cause and recognizing him as their ally. Go ahead. The curator of history at the African American Museum of California in Southern California, Susan Anderson, has literally said that Thomas Starr King may have been the only true white anti-racist in the entire state in those years. On the 1st of August in 1860, again, this is just months after his arrival, he addressed the entire black population of San Francisco on what was then known as Emancipation Day. That is the anniversary of the ending of slavery in the British colonies, including Jamaica and the Caribbean. This is a direct quote. "Wherever we find many races brought together, there God has his greatest work to do." By the way, I would say that this is Thomas Starr King's interpretation of American exceptionalism. That it is that challenge of being multiracial and multicultural that is the divine task of this country. There is room for the noblest labor of Christianity. The greatest work that was ever wrought by the early Christians was when the disciples went beyond the borders of Judea and controverted the current doctrine that Gentiles had no rights a Jew was bound to respect, and taught that Christianity had no respect for rank or color or sect. The Almighty had a great mission for this nation. Here the church was to proclaim the equality of the races. Wherever the oppressed were congregated, there Christ was present, and not on the side of power. Into such a presence, he said, I always come with reverence. The San Francisco Evening Bulletin reported that people wept at his words. Go ahead. Next slide. One of those leaders in his congregation that is often forgotten is Bret Hart. Because the work that they both saw needed to be done was not just political. It was what underlies all lasting change, that is cultural transformation. From being a violent and pro-Southern, individualistic, every white man for himself culture, Thomas Starr King devoted himself to bringing about a cultural transformation of this state, which I would claim has actually lasted. With Bret Hart, he became the functional head of that salon that Jesse had started. He set out to tie California to the Northeast culturally and not just politically, as he wrote in a letter to James Fields, the editor of The Atlantic and his own editor with the White Hills book. He was going to preach nothing but Tickner and Fieldsism. His series of lectures on great American poets, which he did in order to raise the funds for the organ in the new church that was being built for him, is actually cited as one of the key moments in the canon formation of American literature in the 19th century. He knew personally people like William Cullen Bryant and Whittier and Holmes and Longfellow and Emerson. I have had the privilege of looking at the letters he received from those people, those distinguished authors, that are held at the Society of California Pioneers. He had the chutzpah to ask each of them to send him an unpublished poem that he would read at the end of his lecture about them. He raised over $2,000 from the series of 6 lectures. But here's another thing. He was constantly finding new talent. Bret Hart was the editor of a literary magazine called The Golden Era, and it published some little scraps of poetry by a fellow who named himself Peter Pepperpot. But the verses were more serious than that and really quite touching. And Starr King went down to a local bookstore and said, I'm told by Bret Hart that you're the author of these verses. Is that true? And 19-year-old, very shy, Charles Warren Stoddard muttered, yes. And Starr King gave him free tickets to the lectures about the famous poets. Charles Warren Stoddard went on to become California's first openly gay writer. Later, he corresponded with Walt Whitman. He was also an inspiration to California's first poet laureate, Ina Coolbrith. Some of you who live near Russian Hill may know the park that is named for Ina. She went on to become the first public librarian in Oakland, among other things, where she influenced all kinds of succeeding writers from Jack London to Joaquin Miller and so forth. But the story about her is that she was actually an escapee from Mormonism and the niece of the Mormon prophet, Joseph Smith. And as I mentioned, he hosted Emerson's son and sent him home with Watkins' photographs of Yosemite. Go ahead. He needed a larger church. 1,000 seats on Stockton Street was not enough. And so the trustees purchased land on Geary, just below what is now Union Square, a name given to the open land donated by Colonel Geary, named by Thomas Starr King. The site is now occupied by the Neiman Marcus store. But it was designed, the building that was raised for him in 1863-64, seated 1,600. The former church on Stockton Street, I found this particularly interesting, was sold to an African-American congregation for about 1/3 of what it was worth. And until it was destroyed in 1906 in the fire that followed the earthquake, it was known by that black congregation as the Starr King Church. The purchase was almost certainly financed by their leading member, Mary Ellen Pleasant, who was the first black female millionaire not only in this area, but perhaps in the country. The congregation, said Henry Whitney Bellows, was like preaching to a group that was more influential than the legislature. It included the Stanford brothers, Governor Frederick Lowe, who succeeded Leland Stanford and became the first 4-year governor, Robert Swain, who was the moderator of the church in those years and the director of the U.S. Mint, and almost all of the leading merchants and lawyers, including Andrew Halliday Smith, who was quite young when he joined and made a large contribution to the building of this magnificent building, the inventor of the cable car. But he was also the fellow who, in 1888, determined that the building had been damaged by an 1868 earthquake more than the congregation knew, and that it needed to be torn down and sold for the vacant land so that this church could be built closer to where the residential area was. It was dedicated in 1864. Starr King sadly got to preach in it only 7 times before he contracted diphtheria out on a speaking engagement, which combined with the underlying tuberculosis led to pneumonia and his death. 20,000 people attended his funeral, filling not only the church, obviously, but all of Union Square. Let's go on. Here's another thing that is very rarely lifted up. What an ecumenical and interfaith pioneer he was. In 1864, on the 4th of July, he was invited by the Episcopal Sunday School Society to address a picnic for the children of the city. The diocese was appalled that a non-Trinitarian was being given this assignment. Let's just say that the ensuing news coverage made them look petty and Starr King look magnanimous. The same thing went on when he lectured for free in support of a Methodist-sponsored ministry to sailors and seamen. The Methodist clergy objected. They looked petty. Starr King looked inclusive. When he went out of town to go to Yosemite, he had one of the liberal Methodists fill his pulpit for him. He joined with the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians, including Henry Durant, who started as a Congregationalist minister and became a Unitarian, in founding what became known as the College of California. He exchanged pulpits, most strikingly, with Rabbi Elkin Cohen of Temple Emmanuel, which built a building with the same architect as the Unitarians had hired in Moorish style on the other side of Union Square. So his interfaith commitment, now so faithfully carried forward by the school that bears his name, is something that also should be remembered as having deep roots. Go ahead. Here's a rare image of Starr King in the pulpit of the 1864 building. Notice the flamboyant Gothic architecture. It's actually a photograph of a painting of him in that position. And we still have, of course, the chancel furniture, although the pulpit has been divided, with one of the wings of the pulpit being turned into today's lectern. And that's an image of Mount Starr King at the back end of Yosemite Valley. It's one of the more magnificent summits in the park, but fairly inaccessible. I've also hiked Mount Starr King in the White Hills, which is at the north end of the... So here you have a guy who's got two mountains. Rosemary, you're not the only school named for him. There's an elementary school here in San Francisco and a middle school down in Los Angeles. Let's go ahead. But the full impact of Thomas Starr King should be understood as not just political. Religiously, he brought Transcendentalist theology to the West Coast, including its deep reverence for nature and its non-sectarian inclusivity. Culturally, he tied the West Coast to the Northeast even before the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad. Racially, he deliberately joined when he was named the Grand Orator of the Masonic Grand Lodge of California, he realized he didn't have a local lodge that he'd joined. He joined the Chinese Lodge. I was telling Rosemary beforehand, I think that's because he recognized that he still had some residual prejudice. The Chinese population out here was perhaps the most threatened. And in the 1870s, it turned utterly violent. Environmentally, not only his nature writing, but his crucial role in preserving Yosemite Valley really kicks off the whole national parks movement and the preservation of public lands across the United States. And educationally, through the College of California, where he gave the first commencement address on the duties of students during their years of learning. He laid the groundwork for higher education in this state. Go ahead. That, I think, is a neglected legacy also. It really gets lived out by his successor, Horatio Stebbins. But Stebbins was simply stepping into Starr King's role as a trustee of the College of California, that small liberal arts college for men that was then located in Oakland. When Frederick Lowe, his parishioner, the governor of the state, came to Stebbins and said, I understand the college, of which you are now the chair of the trustees, has been given some land north of Oakland. And I have been given a charge by the legislature to establish a school of higher education emphasizing agriculture and the mechanical arts. You have land, I have the money. Stebbins essentially said, I will arrange for the college to transfer its charter back to the state, along with the land, on the condition that the university founded there always include the liberal arts. And by the way, when Horace Davis, Starr King's son-in-law, was president of the University of California, it established the groundwork of what became the Graduate Theological Union, a public university adjacent to and open to a fully interfaith and ecumenical array of institutions preparing people for religious leadership. So Stebbins and Lowe are the effective founders, along with Henry Durant, of the University of California. And Stebbins, you should know, also was the principal advisor to Leland Stanford and his wife in founding Stanford University. So this legacy of impact on higher education, all too forgotten, is also preserved, of course, by the seminary that bears its name. How fitting, then, that on the 200th anniversary of Starr King's birth, the Starr King School for the Ministry, as I said, a small but clearly the most progressive school of theological education in North America, should try to honor Thomas Starr King, its namesake, by raising another $200,000 in his name. I want to tell you this morning that my wife and I are giving $2,000, Rosemary. And I'm going to ask all of my hearers today to consider what multiple of 200, even if it's 200 pennies, you might lift up to honor Thomas Starr King. This guy, you know, the Orthodox Christians have got their saints, like St. James, and they don't know their stories. And we've got just a few who made such a difference with their integrity, their courage, and their devotion to the future that we lose sight of them at our peril, our spiritual peril. Let's remember Thomas Starr King at 200 and make sure that the educational legacy that he left behind goes on beyond these years and beyond our own. Thanks for your attention. I stand open to your questions.
There was recently in the Smithsonian magazine, I think just maybe 2 or 3 months ago, a full article about the wide awakes.
Yes.
And
right. There's a book out.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to know if you were aware of that.
Yes. I've read the book, and the author is a member of the Smithsonian staff, curator there. They're just coming to light because they were rather secretive and kind of a flash in the pan. They arose in the summer of 1860. When Lincoln was nominated. They recognized that there was going to be violence when he traveled east. But here in San Francisco, they transformed themselves into a civil guard. One of the things that frustrates me is I've been trying to research how many members of the church belong to the Wide Awakes. And although there were a number of newspaper articles about them, and 4 people named, all Unitarians who were their leaders, that there's no membership list that has survived. So it's impossible to know just how many or who was involved in the Wide Awakes here. Great little story coming out. As I say, history is this process of sort of continuous revelation. Keep learning new things. Other questions? Oh, come. Don't be shy. Wayne.
I wonder if you can comment on why his legacy in protecting the national parks in Yosemite seems to have been forgotten, because I've been an environmentalist my entire adult life. I've heard John Muir's story 100 times, and I've literally never heard this until today. So given his prominence in California politics in the 1860s, why did we forget his role in Yosemite?
Well, I think Muir overshadowed him, the founding of the Sierra Club, and the fact that, you see, the Yosemite Bill in 1864, although it really launches the preservation of public lands on a national level, wasn't a national park bill. it turned Yosemite over to the state of California in perpetuity for public recreation and conservation purposes. But the national parks don't come along until the Teddy Roosevelt era, when Muir is still alive. Muir, by the way, was an Emersonian, very much influenced by a Unitarian professor he had at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and basically one of those Unitarians who never bothers to go to church. He was out in the woods worshiping there. So, you know, I don't hold it against him, but he did overshadow Thomas Starr King.
Yes, I just want to ask, is there a biography of Thomas Starr King that you would recommend? You just happen to have one in your...
Well, you know, there have been several. One of the best was actually published in the 1870s, a tribute to Thomas Starr King, by a man who knew him as a boy. The most recent, the one by Glenna Matthews, sadly has only a short chapter on his boyhood and education and the backstory before he gets to California, because the publisher, Cambridge University Press no less, was interested in nothing except the political impact. And there's another book by a still living Unitarian down in Pacific, what's the name of that? It's the peninsula, Pacific Palisades, California, in Southern California. Robert Monzingo, who's, of all things, a NASA engineer by training, he wrote a biography of Thomas Starr King that was privately published back in the, I want to say, the late 80s or early 90s. Sadly, if you go to try to buy one on the used book market, it's a paperback that now sells for $990 because it's become so rare. So there's a good case to be made for writing a fresh, full biography of this man. I would like to see it accompanied by a volume of his selected writings.
Yeah, right.
Not only his sermons, wonderful sermons like Yosemites of the Soul, the living waters of Lake Tahoe, but some of the sermons that he preached in Boston, which, by the way, he had to reuse out here. He was very careful. He marked on the back of all of his manuscripts when he preached or repreached them. There are 400 manuscript sermons at the Boston Public Library, of which I have scanned about 80, focusing on those that were clearly responses to public events or exemplars of his transcendentalist thinking. But there needs to be a good deal more research. His life was so brief. You know, he was only 39 when he died. That's another factor in his being forgotten. Because he died during the Civil War, there is a huge focus on those who died in battle. My article of about 9,000 or 10,000 words on him, which will appear in the Argonaut, the journal of the San Francisco Historical Society next year, refers to him as a civilian hero of the Civil War. And I think that's a very fitting way to remember his public impact in that realm. But when I collect his writings, I want him remembered as the man who brought Transcendentalism to the West. The Library of America is finally getting around to including in their canon of Transcendentalist writers, you know, Emerson, Thoreau, Melville, Margaret Fuller. Tyler and I have been trying to make the case to them that there should be a volume dedicated to Thomas Starr King, the first transcendentalist of the West Coast, and in many respects, as fine a nature writer as Thoreau was in his journals. No one described a landscape as powerfully as Starr King did, or the awe that one should feel before the magnificence of this creation.
Was there any influence from the development of science of his time that he was influenced to have anti-racist views besides his religious upbringing?
Yeah. So I've written about this, one book leads to another. In my book, Conflagration, about the Transcendentalists as social activists, I do tell the story about how the first positive reception of Darwin's thought was by early Transcendentalists. There's a great scene of Thoreau, Bronson Alcott, Franklin Sanborn, and another man having New Year's dinner discussing Darwin's Origin of Species. But even before Darwin, there was enough evolutionary thinking going on in progressive circles that underlay a lot of transcendentalism, that indeed there's a reverence for science that's right there in the transcendentalist movement. I mean, Emerson was inspired to write Nature, his first book, after having sort of a religious experience in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, seeing just the proliferation and diversity of the natural world. He realized it's all connected. It all has an amazing evolutionary development that includes us. That nature and spirit are not two separate things, but that there is a creative spirit that underlies the natural world. So the connection between religion and science was something that shows up in all of Starr King's writing. He was at pains to keep up with what was going on in astronomy and what was going on in geology. Now, we know a lot more in those fields than was known in his time. The one thing that I did say is that some of the evolutionary thinking of the 19th century was inherently racialist. There was a hierarchy of racial evolution. And what are you going to do? That was the knowledge base of the time. So, frankly, I was appalled during COVID when there were so many extreme reactions to our finally awakening to the legacy of racism in America, that we toppled statues of people of the 19th century who, I mean, you wanted to take Lowell's name off the local high school? Well, it was explained by our enlightened school board that, well, he wasn't a radical abolitionist enough. I wanted to say, who does your history for you? The radical abolitionists in the late 1850s wanted the North to secede from the South and wash its hands and let slavery be in place. Lowell didn't agree. Neither did Frederick Douglass. Neither did most of the Transcendentalists. They wanted to stick with the dream that was still embodied in the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence, even if the Constitution was an imperfect document. People need to understand history more deeply. You know, we Unitarian Universalists don't have a common scripture, but we have a common heritage. And if we don't read and understand our own heritage as a source of remembrance and revelation, of wisdom that is still applicable to the present, we have cast aside one of the great gifts that time and history and God have given us. Don't get me going. America suffers from amnesia. And we Unitarian Universalists, with our fears for the future and our focus on the present, need to ground our spirituality more deeply in the wisdom of the past than we tend to do. Because without that, we will be blown about by the vagaries of history. All right, now I've gone to preaching. By the way, when Starr King ended, one of his first thoughts was of church finances. He told Robert Swain, "Tell them that I want as my memorial the church debt to be paid." And then he said, after he'd recited the 23rd Psalm, "Keep my memory green," a line he borrowed from his fellow Unitarian Charles Dickens. And then he had his wife bring their newborn son to him. "Beautiful boy," he said. And those were his last words. Let's keep his memory green.
On that, that's so beautiful. Are there any visual representations of his life that we can pursue? So much of what we learn from history now is framed and presented in visual form.
I tried to get Robert Ledbetter, the guy who made Boyhood, to turn my book about the Transcendentalists into a film. And I also pitched it to Ken Burns of PBS fame. I knew I'd lost with Burns the minute he crossed his arms. He said, "I'm booked for the next 10 years. I do think that there could and should be a cinematic representation of the Transcendentalists as activists. And if this were turned into a screenplay, it might have Emerson coming here to California, preaching from our pulpit, where he knocked over the flowers, and then going up to Yosemite, which he'd admired in photographs sent to him by Thomas Starr King, and spending a day with John Muir, and saying as he left and waved in benediction to Muir, saying this to his son, "You know, I think that young man may be as fine a naturalist as Henry David Thoreau was." Yeah, there could be a film. I wish somebody would get it together to do it. Although Beacon Press owns half of the proceeds of any film rights, I would gladly give up my own just to see somebody do it. All right, that's enough. Thanks so much.